Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vitor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, today we got a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I always say that. But So let's start with some right-wing domestic terrorist threats, because that's a blast. Then I think we should get into the escalating trade war between the U.S. and China. There have been some updates on the protests in Hong Kong, updates on Iran, updates on Afghanistan. Some new national security personnel will update you on some of the things we talked about last week at the DNI. Why tensions are increasing between Japan and South Korea, also in the Kashmir region. The Trump administration made another move against Venezuela. There is some concern that arms control treaties are dying. And then finally, Lindsay Lohan.
Yeah, it's not going well.
No, not for Lindsay Lohan, not for arms control.
Not for arms control.
Our guest is former National Counterterrorism Center Director Nick Rasmussen, who's worked with Republicans and Democrats to disrupt ISIS plots, Al-Qaeda plots, and unfortunately now domestic terrorist plots. So he's a great guy, works in a bipartisan way, and a real expert on this stuff. Two quick housekeeping things. Our August Crooked miniseries is coming out on Wednesday. It's hosted by Crooked Media's very own Shanika McClendon. It's called Rigging North Carolina. It follows the story of a political consultant accused of fraud in the subsequent trial in North Carolina's 9th District. First episode is dropping on Wednesday. It's going to go through the scandal. It's a really great story. Check it out. One other thing, Ben, you have a major piece on Burma coming out in the Atlantic on Thursday of this week. Is that right?
So it'll be online on Thursday. It's in the next print edition. A long piece about Aung San Suu Kyi, what happened to Aung San Suu Kyi, the Rohingya crisis, aiming to draw on my own experience, but also some reporting I did traveling to Burma earlier this year to try to understand what is going on there. Hopefully people can read it again online on Thursday, and then we can talk about it next week. And I should add, our friend Samantha Power, her book is coming out September 10th.
Yes.
So if you want to check that out. Susan
Get
Rice
ready.
also has a book coming out in October.
Yeah.
So, we'll have a double header there.
The book game is strong. I have read your Burma piece. It is not just a defense of the Obama administration policy.
No.
It's a really tough look at what the hell happened. Because it's something I think all of us have been wondering. Like, Aung San Suu Kyi was this Nobel Prize winning,
human rights icon.
Hero. Yeah.
Who now, is part of a government that has been engaged in ethnic cleansing. I just wanted to answer this basic question. What happened to this person? How were we wrong? Is she the same person? Was she never that person? And so I hope people check it out.
Yeah, it's an awesome piece. Okay, let's start with this week's just horrible domestic terror news. Nick's going to dig into some of the more policy details later, I think. But, we were talking over the weekend about how in some ways what happened with these white supremacists is really the worst case scenario we always feared with Al-Qaeda. These individuals, shooting up malls are in the country already. It is painfully easy to get a weapon of war. They figured out that you don't need to do some hardened target like shoot up the Pentagon or the White House. You just go to a movie theater and you can terrorize an entire nation. I'm curious. I mean, you and I, experienced discussions of these policies in the White House starting back in 2009. But why do you think the response has been so slow? And how do you think the government should better approach the threat from domestic terrorism?
Well, first of all, I think there is an eerie comparison to ISIS here. Mm-hmm. ISIS kind of figured out, right? Al-Qaeda had guys in training camps, and they were constantly trying to plan these spectacular attacks and hijacking aircraft or putting, explosive printing cartridges on cargo planes. ISIS figured out that all you have to do to terrorize people is to go walk in a crowd and shoot people. Yeah. ISIS also had a phenomenon where individuals were radicalized online, and essentially they didn't need to be a part of a terrorist group. They just went out and acted on that ideology. And it feels like the white nationalist movement has mimicked ISIS. The radicalization happens online. You don't necessarily have to be in person recruited. You can just self-radicalize, and you commit these acts of violence. Part of what happened here, Tommy, I remember we had a summit at the White House late in the Obama administration, for instance, on countering violent extremism, and that was the name of the summit. And we were mocked widely for not calling it the summit on radical Islam. You know, and people.
Let's just pause on that for 1 second. That was the single talking point out of Republicans over and over and over again.
And the reason we didn't call it that is because we said at the time, actually, there's a threat from white supremacist extremists in this country too, and we have to view the totality of this threat. And yes, their talking point was to minimize the white nationalist threat and say it's all about radical Islam. And that they kind of browbeat the administration, in Congress, this idea that if you talked about anything but radical Islam, you were selling out America and you weren't taking the threat seriously. I also think, right now there's an uncomfortable reality, which is that if you were trying to deal with this as a national security challenge and saying, what is the threat to the most American people and how do we put resources against that, you would have the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security spending a lot of money and a lot of time trying to unravel what are the sources of white nationalist content? What are the sources of this radicalization? How do we get deeper into communities so that someone who spots this behavior can alert the authorities? And the uncomfortable reality is for them to do that, they'd be essentially pulling a thread on Trump's political base. And I have to think that the political pressure of having a president who embraces some of the same narratives as these white nationalists, that kind of makes people think twice about moving in that direction.
Yeah, it is a huge, huge challenge. Let's get these goddamn guns off the street and then go from there. Okay, let's talk about China for a minute because this trade war is continuing and it's rapidly escalating. So late last week, Trump said he was going to slap 10% tariffs on basically all Chinese imports. So those new tariffs take effect on September 1st. They will cover $300 billion worth of stuff, including a whole bunch of things you might want to buy around the holidays, like phones or video games or toys or whatever. So then on Monday, the Chinese government devalued its currency for the first time in, I believe, a decade. And the stock market just collapsed. It went down, like the Dow went down, I think, 800 points. Later that afternoon, the Treasury Department in the U.S. responded by labeling China a currency manipulator. China has announced that they're going to halt the purchase of American agricultural goods. So, like, the tit for tat just escalated within one day. So, Ben, can we just start with the basics? What does it mean when you devalue your currency, and why do you think China wanted to do it? And what does it mean when you get labeled a currency manipulator by the Treasury?
Well, so first of all, China was responding to Trump escalating the trade war by imposing these new tariffs. And as we've said before, these tariffs are not just a penalty on China, they're a tax on the American people.
Every single American.
Every single American is paying a tax because essentially you're going to pay more, when you buy any goods made in China, the price is going to go up because the companies that sell those goods are going to factor in the tariffs, right? So you are paying for this. That's the first point. Second point, the Chinese haven't, it's been 10 years since it was 7 RMB, that's the Chinese currency, to the dollar, right? So that means that the Chinese acted to make their currency essentially weaker against the dollar. That's a very logical reaction to tariffs because if your currency is weaker, it is cheaper for you to export goods. The price of the goods you're exporting becomes cheaper. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to make up for the increase in price for the goods from the tariffs by making the currency weaker so that Chinese exporters won't be hurt as much. It frankly also hurts them a bit too because it begins to drain their foreign currency reserves. The prices for goods are going up in China as well. But Trump takes this step of labeling China a currency manipulator. What is the effect of that? Nothing.
Right.
I think this is like a really important point. And by the way, pox on Chuck Schumer too. He's been yelling about this for years. But the reality is what happens? You're labeling it, it just means you're declaring that we think that they're manipulating their currency. All that means in practice is we go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and we essentially complain and say, we think the Chinese are manipulating their currency. Interestingly, under the current level of the Chinese currency, the IMF does not even believe that the Chinese are manipulating their currency to the point that they should face a penalty. So this is purely symbolic.
Unless anyone think that it's just a bunch of liberals complaining about Trump who said this, basically the chief economists that deal with China at Citi and Goldman Sachs said the same thing.
Yeah, it's a political response. But why does it matter? It matters because both Trump and Xi Jinping have signaled that they're not looking for the off-ramp, that the trade war will escalate. So it looked like there was going to be an agreement in the spring. Instead of an agreement, we got new tariffs from Trump and the Chinese currency crossing this threshold of 7 RMB to the dollar. And Chinese, if you look at Chinese state media, they're gearing up for the fight. They, just like Trump has been attacking China, they're now attacking Trump. They're saying it's patriotic. We have to dig in. We have to fight this out. And so the reason the markets, I think, plunged and the reason we're in for very rocky waters is neither China or the U.S. seems to have an end game for this trade war we're in. And the consequence could be ever increasing tariffs and responses from China. China saying they're not going to buy any U.S. agricultural products.
That's a big deal.
Huge hit on American farmers. And it's introducing all this uncertainty to the global economy. It's going to make it harder for consumers to buy things, right? Because prices are going up in both the U.S. and China. When consumers aren't buying as many things, the economy inevitably slows down. So what Trump is doing with this trade war, without any kind of logical goal that he's shooting at, is putting at risk the stability of the global economy and American farmers and American consumers without any sense of like where this plane is going to land.
That's exactly right. I mean, so this latest little Twitter tariff tantrum happened because negotiations haven't been going well. Despite the fact that I think Mnuchin said 3 months ago that they almost had an agreement, there was another meeting at a high level in Shanghai, and it like ended after one dinner and in a quick meeting the next day. Nothing got accomplished. So Trump freaked out and said that the China has to follow through on commitments to buy these agricultural products or stop fentanyl sales. So I don't really know what he thinks was agreed to, but you're right. He's completely backed himself into a corner. He's scared of looking soft domestically, but at the same time, the Chinese know exactly where to squeeze him to hurt us economically and politically. So, like, to your point, who wants an off? Like, do the Chinese even want an off-ramp? Or are they just going to wait him out and see if they can get a new person to negotiate with?
Yeah, no, I think that's why the currency thing matters and the Chinese state media posture matters. Is what the Chinese are signaling is we're not going to be bullied by you. And China is not Mexico and Canada, which frankly didn't even make that big concessions to Trump at the end of the day anyway. But we're the second biggest economy in the world, and we can dig in and we can hurt you. And the important thing to remember here is, yeah, Xi has some politics, but he's not worried about his next election, right?
Yeah.
So if there's a trade war and some constituencies in China are hurting, it's not like Xi's worried that he's going to be ousted. What he can do is he can squeeze really hard in electorally important areas, and farmers are in the Midwest. Farmers are in electorally important areas in the United States. So Trump thus far has tried to patch that by shoveling money at farmers, right?
Paying them off.
Paying them off with, I think, $15 billion in assistance, which, is real money that we're paying too, right? So we're paying this tax through the additional tariffs. We're paying to bail out these farmers, which is, let's face it, wealth redistribution. It's just redistribution to people that Trump likes.
Yeah, call Joe the plumber.
Yeah, exactly.
Spreading the wealth around here.
And meanwhile, I think the Chinese have every reason to say, well, let's at least wait and see what happens a year and a half from now in the election, rather than make kind of fundamental systemic concessions here to Trump and reward his behavior. This could precipitate. I mean, everybody file this away because if the economic downturn happens, if there's a recession or a global financial crisis, it's very likely that Trump's actions in this trade war will be a precipitating factor for that.
Yeah. That Joe the Plumber joke was a Obama 08 deep cut, and credit to you if you get it out there.
Google Joe the Plumber.
Spread the wealth around. Okay, let's stay with China. So the protests in Hong Kong are getting more intense. According to the New York Times, on Monday, protesters disrupted about 200 flights, and they blocked roads and railways, and they're calling for a general strike. So a government spokesman went on the record and told the Times that 420 people have been arrested and 1,000 cans of tear gas have been fired. Odd thing to go on the record to say. We're a couple months, I think nearly 2 months into the protests, which isn't as long as the protests in 2014, but they're getting pretty intense. Hong Kong's chief executive spoke for the first time in 2 weeks on Monday. She's openly siding with China. A Chinese government spokesman for their Hong Kong office has been putting out some very ominous statements today. He said demonstrators have, quote, exceeded the scope of free assembly. He warned them not to take restraint for weakness. He called the protesters who attacked one of their offices there rampant and deranged and said a blow from the sword is waiting for them in the future. Yikes. I think you have to wonder if we're going to see the Chinese military, which has a big contingent stationed in Hong Kong, move in soon. It's also notable that Trump has offered no solidarity. In fact, he has basically signaled that he doesn't care, he doesn't think it's our business, and he wouldn't do anything to step in if there is a Chinese crackdown.
Yeah, and thus far the Chinese have not used the military directly. We talked about some of these thugs who showed up and confronted the protesters. I think the more we learn about that, the more it does become apparent that the Chinese government was probably at least giving a wink to people, if not encouraging people, if not paying people to essentially go out and confront the protesters and make this look violent. There's even some reports that they might be leveraging organized crime in Hong Kong to play this role. So they're playing kind of subterranean hardball. If they roll the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, into Hong Kong and try to kind of restore order that way, the problem for them is it puts any lie to this idea that there are two systems, that there's, it's supposed to be one country, two systems. So one country, China, but there's a system in Hong Kong that is freer and more open than the system in mainland China. Once you cross the threshold of putting the military, you're kind of putting the lie to that. And frankly, that ends up hurting them in other places like Taiwan, where they'd like to see Taiwan essentially come into this similar arrangement to Hong Kong. The Taiwanese are looking at us and thinking, is this what we want? Do we want, we have a democracy in a pretty open country. Do we want to essentially be swallowed up by China and have the PLA here in 10 years? The protesters seem to be escalating in response by showing them, okay, look, if you mess with us like this, we're going to mess with the Hong Kong economy. And this is one of the most important financial centers in the world. If flights aren't getting in and out, if there's kind of perceived chaos in the streets, it's going to have an impact on the Hong Kong economy. They're willing to take that risk to send a message to China that, we don't want to live under your thumb. So I think this is going to continue to be a real flashpoint, and the Chinese are clearly pivoting in the direction of zero tolerance here.
Yeah, man, one to watch. Let's stay in Asia for a minute. Things have gotten very bad. You flagged the story for me between Japan and South Korea. Japan apparently was so pissed off that they threatened to stop exporting certain materials that are key to South Korean manufacturing. A bunch of protesters took to their streets in response in Seoul. South Korea apparently threatened to withdraw from an intelligence sharing agreement that allows us to monitor North Korea with the Japanese and with the ROCs. This is all coming as North Korea is just repeatedly firing missiles into the ocean
and
while
building
Trump
new nuclear weapons.
Yeah, while Trump literally pretends everything is fine and tweets about his good friend in North Korea. When asked if Trump would mediate between Japan and South Korea, he said that no, it would be a full-time job. So I guess he wants to keep tweeting at the TV.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is an old dispute. It dates back to World War II and bubbles up periodically. Can you just give us a quick overview of that history and what's happening here?
So, the Japanese were longtime colonizers of the Korean Peninsula. Then in World War II, they committed a series of atrocities against Koreans. Most emotionally for the Republic of Korea, thousands of Korean women, so-called comfort women, were essentially enlisted into sexual slavery by the Japanese. You can see why this is a searing wound for the Korean people. And there, over the decades, been a series of efforts to kind of mediate this history, to have the Japanese pay compensation for these women, to have the Japanese apologize for this history, but it flares up occasionally. It flared up under Obama in a very serious way, in part because some of the last of these comfort women are dying. So we brokered an agreement between Japan and South Korea in 2015 that involved, a mix of Japanese expression of apology and regret, also involved things like, building monuments to the comfort women, setting up foundations that deal with commemorating this issue, and essentially we're able to get them back to working together. I should add, the reason this is important is those are our two closest allies in Northeast Asia. And if you're dealing with North Korea as a united front, the three of us, we all share intelligence, our militaries all cooperate, you're in a much stronger position. If we're all split, if Japan and South Korea aren't working together and the U.S. is isolated from them, that's a giant opening for the Chinese and the North Koreans to take advantage. While we're over here fighting, the North Koreans, basically what's happening, is what the risk is, which is North Koreans are building nuclear weapons, they're firing off missiles, the Chinese are essentially trying to make up for the breakdown in Japan-Republic of Korea relations by moving in as a trading partner. And over time, the alliance falls apart, China gains influence, the North Koreans are emboldened, right? Yeah. That's the risk. Now, what's happened is Japan has a pretty nationalist government under Shinzo Abe, and members of his party have essentially made inflammatory statements at times, or have not kind of sufficiently been willing to atone for the past. There are textbooks in Japan that suggests that it's an open question as to whether the Japanese forced these comfort women into sexual slavery or not. The Koreans respond to that by complaining, by threatening to stop buying certain products, and what's needed is the U.S. to play a really aggressive mediation role and to keep them talking to each other. Trump clearly doesn't want to do that. Mike Pompeo, clearly, despite his quote-unquote swagger, has been unable to do that. They basically insulted Pompeo by saying they weren't going to have this meeting with the three of them and try to reach an agreement. So the U.S. looks weak in Asia, and our allies are fighting with each other. And if it leads to the South Koreans suspending this intelligence relationship, that's a direct problem for our national security, because intelligence sharing on North Korean threats is essential. What are they up to? What is their military doing? What are these missiles doing? When there is a North Korean launch or test, the way in which we know what happened is usually because lots of information is shared among the three of us. So this will have real national security implications.
Yeah, and we got 28,500 U.S. service members sitting in Korea, and a whole bunch more in Japan. So yeah, hopefully Pompeo can find a way to help this out.
It's a sign that this nationalism that Trump represents is infecting everybody.
Yeah.
Because the Koreans and the Japanese are acting in a very nationalist way. We're fighting about history, not looking forward. I think it's yet another consequence of this nationalist trend we see everywhere.
Yes, and we'll have a little more of that later when we talk about Kashmir.
Yes.
Let's do a couple of personnel updates. So, in a win for common sense, Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence, Congressman John Ratcliffe, withdrew. It became clear that he had lied on his resume about any relevant national security experience he might have had before getting to Congress. And then he has essentially no interest in the Intelligence Committee's work. He didn't go to the reading room to look at intelligence. He didn't go on trips. He did nothing. So great pick. Let's hope this one doesn't sit vacant for too long. The Senate did confirm Kelly Knight Craft to be Trump's ambassador to the United Nations. She actually got 5 yes votes from Democrats.
It's mystified.
It's mystified, but the way she got it was she finally had to state that humans contribute to global climate change. Yeah. So that's a brave stand.
Which she obviously doesn't believe.
I know.
I mean, people should know that this is the wife of a coal magnate.
Yep.
So her primary qualification to be ambassador to Canada, which was before, is she's married to a rich coal guy.
Yeah.
And she gave an interview in Canada and saying that there are two sides to climate science, right? To quote Trump, we're not sending our best here.
No. Yeah, that shit does not fly in Canada. I mean, just a reminder that Nikki Haley was confirmed 96-4. So bipartisan votes can't exist if you put up a qualified nominee.
Yes, someone who believes in climate change.
Yeah. So the last person Trump had put up for this position, Heather Nauert, former Fox News host, becomes a State Department spokesperson. She washed out over vetting concerns. What you mentioned, how Kraft was ambassador to Canada. She was criticized for spending 7 months out of 2 years at her homes in the U.S., so apparently she wasn't the best ambassador. It's an important position.
Yeah.
She shouldn't have been confirmed. It's hard for me to muster the outrage because I'm just generally out of it, but damn it, this sucks.
Yeah, I mean, the UN ambassador is often the first form of response to something happening around the world.
Yeah.
There's a Russian invasion of Crimea, or there's a crisis in the Middle East, or there's a North Korean nuclear test. And all attention turns to the UN and the UN Security Council. And the first person giving the view of the United States is your UN ambassador, the person who has to literally mobilize the world behind, say, a sanctions regime through the UN Security Council is this person. What is her qualification to do that? I mean, this is absolutely insane. We care so little about the rest of the world. We care so little about the United Nations that the wife of some Trump donor who doesn't believe in climate change, who couldn't even, Canada's not a hardship post where you have to be home 7 months out of 2 years. It's also right across the border,
you
right?
You can hang out in Canada.
It's, you can hang out in Canada. It's not that.
Montreal's nice.
It's not a tough place to be, right? And what kind of message does it send to the world?
It's a middle finger.
That this is the person we think should sit behind a placard that says United States of America and represent our country.
Some big names have been in that seat.
Let's see.
George H.W. Bush.
So the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Adlai Stevenson convincing the world that the Russians had moved nuclear missiles to Cuba. George H.W. Bush, Susan Rice and Samantha Power under us. Richard Holbrooke. John Bolton, unfortunately, under
sadly.
Bush 1. I mean, Bush 2.
Some good ones, couple bad apples.
Couple clunkers in there, you know.
It's also just worth flagging that John Huntsman has resigned his post as U.S. ambassador to Russia. He's going to run for governor of Utah. I know that some people like Huntsman. They think he's moderate. They wish the Republican Party were more like him. To be honest, I just see a guy who is like so nakedly full of ambition that he'll work for Trump, he'll work for Obama, he'll do whatever. He's just kind of a hack.
So in 2009, Huntsman was our ambassador in Beijing for Obama. And we were there, and it was in a room. It was just me and Huntsman and Obama and David Axelrod. I don't even remember why that group of people was talking to each other.
We did it on a weird Saturday announcement or something.
And Huntsman was talking about the healthcare debate, and he said, I don't know what's happened to the Republican Party. In 2009, right? This is kind of losing its mind. And in private, I think the reason why a lot of people say nice things about John Huntsman is in private, he's like, yeah, the Republican Party has gone off the rails. He was saying that to us back in 2009. And yet he agreed to serve as Trump's ambassador in Moscow at a time when Trump is doing the Helsinki summit, cozying up to Putin. Trump is running down our intelligence community. Trump is kind of doing nothing to stand up to Russian aggression. He's consistently kind of compromised what people surmise he thinks about things to be in these jobs. And, now history will record that he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia when the American president stood in Helsinki and essentially agreed with Vladimir Putin over his own intelligence community.
That was a fun day.
Yeah, good legacy.
Yeah, congrats, John. A couple Afghanistan updates. So last week we talked about how Trump told Mike Pompeo that he wants to get that he wants to withdraw troops from Afghanistan by the election, not all of them, but a big chunk. So like clockwork here, Lindsey Graham went to the press to lobby Trump to keep them there. So not surprising. But there were two articles that I read recently, two recent data points that I wanted to flag that make a national security argument for why I think we should probably get out. The first is a UN report that says Afghan security forces and coalition forces have killed more civilians in Afghanistan than the Taliban. So the UN says that in the first 6 months of this year, 1,400 civilians have been killed and 2,400 wounded. They believe that Afghan and allied coalition forces are responsible for 52% of those civilian deaths. So I obviously can't verify those numbers. I'm not pointing the blame at U.S. service members here, but it's impossible to win hearts and minds if that data is accurate, if we're more of a threat to the people who live in the country than the Taliban. The second report was the Times reported that there's a split between the military and the intel community over whether ISIS forces in Afghanistan threaten the West or not. So apparently the military thinks that ISIS in Afghanistan could inspire or direct attacks against Western countries. The intel guys believe that they are more likely to fight the Taliban than us. They're waging an internal war in Afghanistan. So I guess you see these two data points, and it's at best debatable whether there's a threat to the U.S. homeland emanating from Afghanistan anymore. The suffering for the Afghan people is unimaginable. I mean, even if you try to set aside the politics, the history, we were just deciding this blank slate, it's hard for me to really think of a good argument for staying, except that people think we need to prop up the government.
Well, look, the tragedy, too, is that this country has been basically at war since the 80s when the Soviets were fighting down there. Can you imagine your whole life?
No.
I think that the civilian casualty number is an indictment of the Trump policy in the sense that at the end of the Obama administration, we had drawn down to 10,000 troops, but we'd also significantly scaled back the kind of support. We weren't doing air support for offensives by the Afghan security forces. We were trying to kind of restrain elements of the Afghan security forces in some of the offensives that they did. When Trump made his policy change, he essentially, we're taking the gloves off. We're going to be back in the business of providing air support. We're going to have troops back in combat. It's not the fault of the troops. It's the directives that are being given and the rules of engagement. If you start dropping more bombs on the country, you're going to kill more civilians.
Yeah.
If you are supporting and encouraging the ANSF to go on more offensives, they're going to kill more civilians. And to what end? Because you cannot win this war militarily. The Taliban is not going to be defeated on the battlefield. If that's not clear, after 20 years. Like, how much longer do we need to wait before we have that evidence? And better to wind down the fighting, try to end this violence, and try to play a diplomatic role to encourage these sides to essentially come to some power-sharing agreement. The ISIS thing, like, of course, like, this is the justification. Like, well, if we don't leave here, maybe there'll be a threat from here. Mm-hmm. That's a recipe for never leaving and continuing to pulverize this country that has already had decades of war. And again, it's not an indictment of our troops. It's the policy that is being given to them to carry out. And the fact is, if we leave and there's an ISIS safe haven that emerges, we could fire a missile at it. We could treat it as we do ISIS safe havens in other places. You don't need to be fighting a war in the country with 15 to 20,000 U.S. troops in order to take a shot at an ISIS safe haven. So even if there is a threat, like the idea that we need to be permanently fighting in this war that is not working, that is killing civilians, that is not eliminating the Taliban, because maybe if we aren't fighting that war, someday there could be an ISIS safe haven, is an insane rationale.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I led with that Lindsey Graham anecdote is not just because I love slapping him around, and I do. I think he's a total bozo. But that conventional wisdom, you hear it from Lindsey Graham. I heard it from Ash Carter when he was sitting in that chair, Obama's Secretary of Defense, which is basically the argument that if we just show enough resolve and stick-to-itiveness and wait out the bad guys, that we'll eventually get to a better place and negotiate a better solution, and it will lead to a more peaceful outcome for the Afghan people. I just think that 19 years have shown that that logic is faulty and that it's time to try something else.
If you are a 25-year-old fighting in the Taliban, you've been fighting your entire life. The idea that if the U.S. shows resolve through the form of Lindsey Graham on a Sunday talk show halfway around the world, and more bombs being dropped on your country, which is part of the reason why you're fighting in the first place, like that's just willful ignorance of what we've learned over the last 20 years. The Taliban lives in these places. These are tribal connections in certain places in Afghanistan. It's just the reality of the makeup of that country. It doesn't mean the Taliban don't do horrific things. They do. It just means that unless the United States is willing to put in like 500,000 troops to pacify the entire country, we're not going to defeat them with 15 or 20,000 U.S. troops in perpetuity. We've learned that.
Yeah. Let's stay in the region. Let's stay in the region and talk about Kashmir. We've talked about it a few times on the show. It's a potential nuclear flashpoint between India and Pakistan with a long, fraught history. On Monday, the Indian government made a major move, and they revoked Kashmir's special status and limited its autonomy. Ben, can you give us like the quick and dirty on what that means or the significance?
It's a good nerding out day.
Yeah, it's fun.
So essentially, Kashmir is the only region in India that has a Muslim majority in the province, right? And the Indian constitution and Indian governance has always provided a certain degree of autonomy for that region. So it's a part of India, at least India views it that way. Pakistan sees it as contested, but there's been this degree of autonomy there. What the Indian government did is essentially eliminate that and restore kind of direct federal authority and responsibility for governance, which is hugely inflammatory in Kashmir because people don't like this. It will create openings for extremists and Pakistanis and, frankly, just ordinary people who resent this. And it could lead to more violence in the form of terrorist attacks in Kashmir or, provocations emanating from Pakistan. So it's a pretty aggressive move. And I think what it shows is two things. This Hindu nationalist government under Narendra Modi that just got reelected is feeling emboldened and feeling like they can blow through previous lines that weren't crossed. The second thing it shows, we sat here like 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump, after putting the Pakistani prime minister on the people mover Dulles, has this crazy press spray in the Oval Office where he indicates he's going to mediate the dispute.
Yeah, how'd that go?
Within weeks of doing that, the Indians essentially say, not only are you not going to mediate this dispute, we're going to get ahead of you and restore direct control here. This is a gigantic embarrassment to the President of the United States. And nobody will talk about it because everybody's focused on the fact that he's a racist white nationalist, understandably. But my God, what a failure.
Yeah.
Like literally within weeks of the guy hosting the Pakistani prime minister and saying he's going to insert himself into this, the Indians essentially insert themselves into it and say, we're going to do one of the most provocative things that we can do. Yet again, his random comments and sprays that seem like they don't have consequences. Well, look at the outcome of what he's done.
Yeah, and if the intel community somehow missed this, we got problems because the Indian government moved 35,000 additional troops into Kashmir last week. Tourists were evacuated.
They cut off internet service, I think, for a period of time.
Yes, Kashmir officials, as you said, condemned the move, as did Indian politicians who oppose Modi. The Pakistanis are furious.
Yeah.
Imran Khan said, quote, "I fear they may initiate ethnic cleansing in Kashmir to wipe out the local population." I mean, that's a big deal. But I mean, you sort of alluded to this earlier about this nationalist spread from China, Japan, India. I mean, in your opinion, how does this compare to the Chinese government cracking down in Hong Kong or the Russians annexing Crimea? I mean, how should the U.S. respond to something like this?
It's a great question. I mean, I think what you see is, look, another analogy is the Chinese government having 1 million Uyghurs in detention in Western China. Big powers, China, Russia, the United States, India, the big powers, clearly feel like there's no reason to abide by traditional international norms or standards. There are UN Security Council resolutions about Kashmir and how this should be dealt with that India is ignoring, for instance, in this case. And, we hear a lot about norms, international law. It seems like this kind of, inconvenience or this thing that a bunch of weenie lawyers at the UN talk about until you need it, right? And I think what you're seeing is when countries feel like it's the law of the jungle and international law or international norms don't matter anymore, like you get pretty unstable outcomes. And the first people to suffer are ethnic minorities, right? Because if you're sitting in Kashmir and you're a Muslim citizen of that state and you see 35,000 Indian troops coming in
freaked out.
and direct role, you're freaked out. I'm vulnerable. Maybe I'll end up like the Uyghurs in China, or maybe, I'll end up like the Muslim Tartars in Crimea, who the Russians have suppressed, right? But ultimately, these things can lead to actual wars too, right? Because, wars are usually fought over territorial flashpoints. And the more we're creating these, with the Indians and the Pakistanis in Kashmir, with obviously the Russians going into Crimea, with the Chinese and potentially Taiwan and Hong Kong, like this is one of these flashpoints will actually catch fire, right?
Yeah, man, it's this scary one,
and it's why the U.S. needs to be for an international system of laws and norms and consequences for countries that violate those laws and norms. Like, because if we just toss out the rule book, everybody's going to break the rules, and that's what's happening under Trump.
Yeah, it'd be good to have strong diplomats too. Two things I guess are more in the just sort of update category. So on Tuesday, the Trump administration put in place a total economic embargo on Venezuela. So that means they're freezing all government assets. They're prohibiting any transactions with Venezuela. The National Security Advisor, John Bolton, he's in Peru today, Tuesday, and is going to give a speech where he justifies the move by talking about how previous embargoes on Panama and Nicaragua were effective.
Cuba, not effective.
That one's going real well. What year are we on?
Yeah,
60 something.
Sixth decade.
So the Wall Street Journal pointed out that in July, the International Monetary Fund predicted a 35% economic contraction for Venezuela this year. So that means we are like hammering and crushing an economy that had basically already collapsed. So again, I mean, this is a question that you raised earlier about a couple issues. Frankly, is like, what's the end game? Like, I know they want Maduro to go. They are crushing the Venezuelan economy and not really incentivizing them to leave or seemingly having any of the talks we need to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing is this will hurt more Venezuelans. They will suffer more. What it feels like to me is Trump was frustrated, Bolton was frustrated. Remember John Bolton taping videos declaring that Maduro is about to leave. Mike Pompeo putting out that Maduro had a plane on the tarmac and was going to get on it. Well, here we are, weeks, if not months later, and that hasn't happened. Step back. China trade war getting worse. North Korea building more nuclear weapons and firing off missiles. Iran preparing to restart its stockpile of enriched uranium. Maduro still there. None of these planes are landing, and there's no fucking aircraft controller, to try to detangle what all these different crises. And I mean, this is really frightening stuff because the bottom is kind of falling out of the Trump foreign policy in all these different places, And where is this going? There's no sense of like all they know how to do is the next pressure point, and we don't like how China responded to our terrorists, so we'll label them a currency manipulator. Nothing will come of that. We don't like that Maduro hasn't left yet, so total embargo. Well, the Venezuelan people will suffer, and I don't see Maduro leaving right now. And so they're just firing bullets and emptying the chamber without any real strategy to get from A to B.
Yeah, and okay, so they're also just flailing.
Yeah.
I mean, the foreign policy, the grand strategy is unclear, and then the tactics in the near term are silly. So let's take an example. Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, was invited to the meeting with Trump in the Oval Office 2 weeks ago. Then the administration, when he said no, decided to sanction him. So they invited the guy to talk, the guy who would negotiate a diplomatic solution, and then they sanctioned him. So meanwhile, Iran is still seizing tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, like Chinese companies are finding ways to smuggle fuel out of Iran. The international community is totally divided on the response. So again, this is more an update than it is a question or anything else, but it does feel like the bottom is falling out a little bit on some of these policy choices.
Well, Iran's a great example, right? And you just gave the. They say they want a deal, and they're so eager for one that they're doing something that we never did, inviting the foreign minister to an Oval Office meeting, and then when that doesn't happen for pretty obvious reasons, because if you're Zarif, like you can't go meet with the president who's just thrown all these sanctions at you, hurled all these insults at you, almost bombed your country, without getting on a limb that gets sawed off. Because the hardliners back home are going to be like, what are you doing and having that meeting when all we've gotten from the Trump people are threats and sanctions? And instead of trying to figure out how to build up to that kind of meeting, right? Diplomacy, hard work, multiple meetings at a lower level before you get in the room. They just say, okay, we're going to throw sanctions on this guy. I saw some reports that said that they wanted to, fire another bullet of the sanctions, because it would make, AIPAC happy. They welcomed it. Netanyahu, the Saudis, showing that we're being tough to all this collection of friends that Trump has. But in practice, you just slam the door in your own face for the diplomacy you want to get. So there's this kind of incoherence, and the only thing they know how to do is escalate. And again, the thing that worries me really is you keep escalating in all these different places. The China thing could lead to a global recession. The Iran thing could lead to a war. The Venezuela thing is going to hurt a lot of people. The escalation has a cost.
Yeah, not great in Iran. Speaking of arms control, Ben. This is a story that I think should be getting a lot of attention, but just isn't. So I wanted to raise it today. Previously, we've talked about how John Bolton hates arms control, and they are just systematically walking away from a whole bunch of arms control agreements with the Russians that were set up. They used to be bipartisan, that Reagan was a champion of, and suddenly we're at a very different place. So we pulled out of a treaty called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force, or INF Treaty, with Russia. In fairness, we did so in part because they were violating that treaty, but that doesn't mean you abandon the whole thing.
Yeah.
You could try to amend it, but now the U.S. is developing new weapons, which apparently is pissing off the Chinese, who announced overnight that they will not, quote, stand idly by and be forced to take countermeasures if the U.S. deploys intermediate-range ground missiles in Asia. So there's some consequences that they probably didn't anticipate. Then there's the New START Treaty. This treaty that Obama negotiated reduces the number of nuclear weapons that are deployed by the U.S. and Russia. It expires in 2021, and the Trump administration is apparently not sure that they want to renegotiate it because, Bolton says it's another Obama deal that's bad, blah, blah, blah. But look, the thing had to go through the Senate and got 71 votes. So again, it's just an issue that in normal times, I think would be front page news, would be on TV, would be getting talked about, because at the end of the day, the number of nuclear weapons that are on, red alert in a plane or in a bunker somewhere is a big existential deal. But we're just distracted from all this stuff.
Yeah, after World War II, the thing that the world decided you needed agreements for the most were try to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, because the more people have nuclear weapons and the more nuclear weapons there are, the greater risk that they get used. And at the end of the Cold War, there's this opportunity to roll back the threat of nuclear weapons, and a lot of agreements were reached, and agreements like the INF Treaty were fundamental to the global kind of non-proliferation and arms control regime. And, by kind of systematically taking apart the global non-proliferation regime and arms control regime, they're just green lighting the Russians to build new nuclear weapons, the Chinese to build new nuclear weapons. We know the North Koreans are building new nuclear weapons. Trump doesn't seem to care about that as long as he gets nice letters from Kim. This is going to make the world more dangerous, and the things we've talked about come together. Because think about some of the situations we've discussed. The Indians and Pakistanis have nuclear weapons, right? The Chinese have nuclear weapons. The more there's this kind of mixture of a lack of agreements and treaties to regulate and limit nuclear weapons, combined with escalation in different areas, like the unthinkable could happen at some point, right? And so I think this idea of how do you reinvigorate and reinvest in arms control agreements and reduce the spread of nuclear weapons and limit the use of nuclear weapons and deployment of nuclear weapons has to be a part of the foreign policy for all these Democratic candidates. I'll try to find the silver lining here, Tommy, which is that, yes, Trump is kind of taking an eraser to the world, to the agreements and institutions and practices that have kind of governed how the world operates. We've talked a lot about the downside. I think the opportunity for a Democrat is to say, like, here's my vision for how to restore this and build it back better. Like, what is an updated 2.0 version of all of these arms control agreements look like? And yes, it'll be hard to get the Russians into that, but at least put forward that vision. Start talking to the Chinese about this. How do we strengthen the international system to better deal with some of the flashpoints that we've talked about? The Iran nuclear agreement was meant to be a starting point for that type of effort, obviously, in limiting Iran having a nuclear weapon, but also having a diplomatic channel open with the Iranians. And so I think that candidates should be thinking big about, okay, Trump is essentially broken apart this international system. What should it look like in 2021? And I think that's a really important debate to be had. Frankly, it would involve moderators in Democratic debates actually asking questions about foreign policy.
Yeah. How'd you feel about that,
yeah,
by the way?
Yeah, well, but because all this stuff is happening around the world, and, I get that it's not as fundamental as healthcare, but any one of these things could become, we could have a flood of people from Venezuela coming here. We could have a war breaking out somewhere. We could have tensions in Kashmir. I think where these candidates are going to have the most power as president is in foreign policy, and so we should hear from them on it.
It's also just a good way. I mean, these questions are not what candidates hear every day on the stump. So it's a good way to figure out who's been briefed, who's doing some reading. Remember when Trump was asked by Hugh Hewitt, of all people, now a Trump lackey, but then someone who was seen as a reasonable journalist, what the nuclear triad is. And then that's the three different ways that the United States has to deploy nuclear weapons.
Ash Carter, big supporter of that
triad.
Yeah.
He clearly didn't know what the nuclear triad was, and I think it exposed him as someone who was totally unqualified for the job. Now, that didn't prevent him from getting elected. We all saw that. But, I mean, I think, the exchange between Steve Bullock and Elizabeth Warren at the debate showed that she's really been thinking a lot about, nuclear weapons and nonproliferation in her campaign and has put forward an agenda. And he didn't seem to have the greatest handle on the concept or the policy. Yeah,
and look, these are issues that matter in people's lives. I remember talking to Stacey Abrams about this, and she said, I got foreign policy in Georgia. Like, I got farmers who are suffering because of this trade war, I've got guns on the streets that are a national security issue, we've got the risk of conflict that we've talked about Afghanistan. Like, we got troops fighting over there. We spent trillions of dollars there. Like, this stuff matters to your pocketbook, to your security, to the economic context that you're in. And we need to hear the vision from these candidates about where they want to lead, not just the United States, but the world. We need some woke worldos out there, woke on arms control here, not just on
go to events, ask questions.
Because essentially, like, people out there care, like people listening to this podcast care, and I, politicians will be responsive to that. And you're right; it reveals something about your kind of basic knowledge and preparedness for the job if you're able to talk about this and put forward a vision for how to deal with this. And it's connected to the democracy piece. If we're not getting our democracy in order at home, how can we advocate for these things abroad, right? So all these pieces kind of fit together in the vision that you want from a presidential candidate.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, most important issue of the day. Page 6 reported on rumors that Lindsay Lohan, that Lindsay Lohan is friends with or maybe romantically linked to friend of the pod, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Freaky Friday, indeed. Their reps denied that this is happening. There's a report that he gave her a gift-wrapped credit card. I assume that'd be on the kingdom. He's flying around his jets. Some people were surprised by this pairing. I would argue that they might be perfect together.
Well, let's remember, Tommy. I mean, we're talking about a very pious, mature, world leader, Mohammed bin Salman, who would never associate with the likes of Lindsay Lohan.
Maybe he's trying to open a club in Mykonos.
Well, it also just shows this kind of bizarre vision of status. I'm a trillionaire, right?
Yeah.
I'm sitting on top of like hundreds of billions of dollars of oil in the sand and a gigantic sovereign wealth fund and yachts and my target for who I would like to fly around on jets and give credit cards to is like Lindsay Lohan.
Big Herbie,
like
fully loaded fan.
Did pop culture stop in like 2005? I mean, was Britney Spears not available?
This is just the weirdest story. Like of all the people to be friends, these two bozos. Yeah, I think there's just an international jet set community of rich and famous.
I didn't know
and
Lindsay
terrible
Lohan
people
was
that hang
part
out.
of that international jet set community.
Yeah. That's a fair point.
But or maybe it's a sign, like, a few months ago, or maybe a little over a year, like before Jamal Khashoggi, like, Mohammed bin Salman was over here in California hanging out with like The Rock.
Yep.
And now he's with Lindsay Lohan, right? So maybe there's been a bit of a diminution in his star power.
There are some questions about sequencing. Maybe they were friends. Maybe these reports or whispers are from before the Khashoggi incident. So you never know. But you're right. Mohammed bin Salman was the great reformer, taking the United States by storm, hanging out with Jeff Bezos, hanging out with Tom Friedman, hanging out with actors in Hollywood and agents and screenwriters. And now we're in a very different place.
It does speak to the fact that, like, there used to be, at least outwardly, this effort to demonstrate kind of sobriety and piety among leaders in countries like Saudi Arabia. It is kind of interesting. Like, Mohammed bin Salman's whole MO, right, is kind of impunity. I can do whatever I want.
Yep.
I can chop up a journalist in another country. I can hang out on yachts with Jared Kushner. And now it's like, I can date Lindsay Lohan because or maybe not, I just hang out with her. I don't know what they're doing, but like,
or at least give a bunch of money to someone that would probably not be seen as acceptable to
as
the
like the
average
first
Saudi.
lady. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, there's something interesting there somewhere.
Yeah, some weirdness.
We are living in kind of like these bizarre times where, like, if you look at these different leaders, right? You got Trump, Stormy Daniels and the sexual assault, and you've got, Bolsonaro, and his kid is like, in all these corruption schemes. There's this kind of sense of like impunity. I can do whatever I want. I can hang out with whoever I want. I can enrich myself in any way I want in lots of places. And I think my hope is, that there's this kind of backlash to that globally. That like the anger that had previously been directed at kind of amorphous political elites. Like, no, like, look at what these leaders are doing. Look at the choices they're making and their policies and their lives. Like, let's like maybe mobilize here and try to get the type of leadership that's more responsive.
Yeah, agreed.
I'm not sure how I got from Lindsay Lohan to that.
You know what? I followed you.
Yeah.
I went on that journey with you. When we come back, I'll talk with Nick Rasmussen, who is the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center from 2014 to 2017.